All right, if I could call this meeting to order, please. Can I have a mover and a seconder for that? Councillor Cabral and Deputy Mayor Coughlin, that the special meeting of Council of the Township of Springwater of March 14, 2019 come to order at 4 p.m. All those in favor? Carried. Anybody disclose a pecuniary interest? All right, seeing none. Well, we welcome MPP Doug Downey to come and give us an update and his thoughts, and thank you for coming.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, and I think this is a great opportunity to dialogue a little bit. I know we do informally around when we're at events and that kind of thing, but to actually lay out some of the pieces that we're working on and what's coming. So we'll, I don't know if you want to, I'm happy to just start and run through some issues.
That'd be
and then
good.
open up
Now,
to questions.
Do you want us to wait till the end to ask questions, or
No,
just
you can
sort
jump
of
in
indicate?
whenever it strikes you is fine with me.
Okay, so
Yeah.
council, whenever you want, just give me a nod and I'll keep looking, and we'll ask questions. Thank you.
Great. So there are a number of pieces that I wanted to touch on. I've tried to focus most of my stuff on municipal, because obviously that's where your interest is, but you're also citizens and you may have other interests beyond that. I'm happy to talk about anything. I guess I'll start with some structural pieces, something that I heard about a lot while we were doing the pre-budget consultations. As you know, I'm the parliamentary assistant in finance, and so one of my roles is to be around the province listening to different municipalities and different stakeholders on what they think is important to go into a budget. And so I heard from about 400 different individuals and groups about what they thought was important, everywhere from Dryden to Sarnia to Ottawa to Fonthill. Something that came up a lot was the OMPF funding, so the OMP funding. And some of you will be familiar with it, some of you may not, but it's a provincial transfer to municipalities, and it's under review. It was being held up in terms of finishing the review. Our government has since said that we're going to flow the money based on last year's numbers and make sure that there's some stability in that. So you'll be receiving a letter. You may not have it yet, but the letter going out this week confirming your numbers for 2019, and they are what they were last year, so there's stability in that. We are moving forward with the review, but you will get lots of lead time on that. We won't be until about 2020 that the numbers may start to change, and we'll communicate well before that for budgeting purposes. It makes sense. You need a budget. You have to set your budget. You need to know. And I'll be reaching out if you have input on how you think we should reform the OMPF. It's one of those things that when you sit on a municipal council, you care about a lot, but the average citizen may not know how much it means. I talked to one municipality east of here that said it's 25% of their budget. It's a big number. So your allocation as last year, $980,500. And again, that letter, if it hasn't landed, should be here in the next day or so. And I can leave some information with the clerk about what the letter looks like that's coming. So I'll start with that. We all know stability is important. The next piece, you may have heard that we announced the provincial federal infrastructure fund. It's a $30 billion fund over 10 years. And the first phase of that infrastructure funding is focused on roads and bridges. It's that kind of infrastructure. It's not water, wastewater, that's down the road, but this is roads and bridges and infrastructure that has to do, particularly if there's health and safety aspects, that kind of thing. The fund is opening on March the 18th, so next Monday is the start date for applications, and it's an 8-week application process. So ideally, things that you've already identified as important in the municipality are already sort of half on the books, ready to go. The funding split will be federal 40%, provincial 33%, and municipal 27%, just in terms of budget impact, what that looks like. So again, we can talk more about that as we go through the process. It is the first of 4 parts of the fund. So part 1 is roads and bridges. Part 2 is public transit, which may not have a direct impact here. I should back up and say the roads and bridges part, the part one, is for municipalities under 100,000. So you won't see a big number come out and all that money go to Toronto or London or Barrie or whatnot. It's focused on rural and northern. That's the component of that fund. Second part is transit. Third part, you'll see some focus on water and wastewater. And then the fourth part, you'll see more on recreation and community. So more details will come out on the others later as we go. But the important part is, ideally, I'm looking at the clerk. The more you have ready to go, the earlier we get it in, the better. And of course, we can dialogue about how long the priority list is and what the ranking is. The more we can do that, the better. I'm happy to have some of those conversations. And next on my list, I want to talk a little bit about regional government review. Obviously, that's something that's a big topic in Simcoe County. And it's something that many of you have probably been involved with, if not directly, indirectly over time, just talking about what that could look like. And this came about because it's been about 50 years since we, as a province, have looked at the large areas that are growing. And the minister appointed two individuals who are quite experienced in the area. They're gathering information. They're talking to all the municipalities, including the separated cities, talking to the county, so upper and lower tier. And as of yesterday, they've opened up a portal for the public to now weigh in. So there's a way for the public to voice their opinion on a couple of things: how services are delivered, in terms of efficiencies, structures. It's quite a wide-ranging list of things to be asked. And I'm just looking for, if they simply go to the website ontario.ca/regional government, there'll be a way to give input on there. It's not just Simcoe County, obviously, as I think most people know. It's Halton and York and Durham and Waterloo and Niagara and Peel and Muskoka and Oxford County. And of course, all the lower tiers involved within those as well. Those public comments are open until April the 23rd. So about a month and a half. So hopefully if anybody's particularly interested and they're watching this on webcast, that they can go to their computer and have their say. Again, I don't know, I guess this is almost a reverse question. I don't know if you've been contacted yet by either of the people that are leading the review. Has there been a formal outreach?
Well, we had the interviews, the meetings with the consultants. Each mayor and generally the CAOs went as well. And that occurred a couple of weeks ago.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
That's good.
Now, the indication there was that those meetings would happen. They talked about this portal you just referred to, and then they would be doing a report that would go to the deputy minister, and that would go up the chain. And the goal was to have a first report out potentially at AMO in Ottawa this August. I'm not sure whether that's still a thinking or not.
Well, I don't have insight into whether that's actually the timeline, but it certainly makes sense to me to be fully engaged in that conversation by the time AMO comes around. It was AMO last year was fantastic. It was, I'll tell you, it's the most delegations that we've ever seen at AMO in terms of ministers engaging. But one of the things that they did, when I say they, ministers that I work with, if there was a meeting with Springwater or with the county of Simcoe or Ormondonte or Barrie, I was invited to those meetings. So I could sit in on the meetings and hear the conversations. And sometimes I would have a little piece of the puzzle and say, can you talk more about this? Because I knew that there was something else happening, and help tease out those bits. So I found that, I think that was very helpful, and hope to do that again next year. So again, as we head up towards AMO, happy to have conversations, sit down with council, have those pieces, so that then when we're sitting in with the ministers, I can move things along as well, formally and informally. Yeah. I'm not sure that everybody on council knows. I sat on a municipal council for 2 terms, and I sat on the board of smaller municipalities, OSUM, for a couple of years. So I really value the AMO and OSUM structure and the way that they can engage with the provincial government. And Steve Clark, the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, was the president of AMO several years ago. So when it came to one of the bills that we were debating early in our term, I actually went through the bios of all of our members, and about a third of them were either school board trustees or had sat on a municipal council. So there's a real deep understanding of how things work in the front lines. So at any rate, we'll keep working with you on that. I'm happy to talk about the regional review if you want to come back to it when we do some questions as well. I want to talk about some of the broader pieces that the government is doing as it relates to agriculture. As you know, well, I'll say it, you may not know, one of the things that we're working on is reducing red tape, which sounds like, you know, a fairly general statement. But red tape is anything that is a process or anything that is a step that you have to do in terms of either interacting with your government or interacting with your customer, with your citizen. We have 380,000 regulatory requirements in Ontario. 380,000. BC has about 250,000. So we made a public commitment on the front end of our government to reduce those interactions, sometimes just duplicative red tape or pieces that really weren't serving any valid purpose. We're going to reduce our overall red tape by about 25%. And that's not an easy job. There's some of the pieces are easy, but some of them take a little more digging. But we have within each ministry, in addition to the work that the government departments are doing, we also have within each ministry a team of MPPs that work with the minister in terms of identifying any kind of red tape that may be buried in the regulations and that kind of thing. So again, as you go through your processes and doing things better, if you identify something that may not make any sense, then please flag it. We have people who will look at it and say, here's why it's there, or have a discussion about why it doesn't necessarily need to be there. So it's about simplifying things. Red tape costs money. It drives up the cost for everybody. And there are lots of examples of that. In farming, we have two ambitious targets, red tape targets by 2020. We want to save Ontario businesses at least $400 million per year in the cost of complying with regulations. That's a hard target. The second is to reduce those by 25%, as mentioned. And every spring and every fall, we're going to bring in legislation to deal with red tape. So there are many windows. It doesn't have to be, here's an idea and it sits around for a year. And we're looking for ideas all the time. So again, even if you run a business, in your private life, if you're running into something, you say, I really don't understand why I have to do this. Please let us know. I just want to touch on, I made a couple of notes so that I would be able to deal with them. I had an agricultural piece that I wanted to chat about. Yeah, they did some study, and they determined that the red tape costs us about $33,000 per business per year, just in terms of time needed to deal with red tape. And we'll get to the AMP process in a second, the mapping process. But after going through that, we then looked into specific programs, and the Wildlife Damage Compensation Fund, as it relates to agriculture. I don't know if anybody has direct experience with it. It wasn't working. The previous government had put in process, you had to take a picture of an animal who had been killed by a coyote or whatever the situation had to be. You take the picture, you send it in, they look at it, they say, send us a different picture. Well, the carcass is already gone. Like, some of this wasn't making any sense. So we've reformed that process a little bit to determine what sufficient evidence is up front so that we're not having to do that second guessing, and that the appeal process is a little more transparent, and training the investigators a little bit more. So just those little pieces, we got rid of some red tape in there and sped the process up, and we think it's more meaningful and more relevant, and the compensation was adjusted to reflect market prices. So that's just one small example of how we can tackle an issue And it's not something that you read about on the front page of the paper. It's not that kind of thing. These are just good grinding. We're just going to grind through all of it and get rid of some of it. So I'll leave that for a moment. Some of the other pieces that I'm working on, we don't have to get too deep into today unless you're really interested. I'm working on the auto insurance reform. So as it relates to auto insurance, that's taking me into some commercial insurance discussions, and in particular sand and gravel challenges they're having in that industry for drivers. I'm dealing with the beverage alcohol review, so it's dealing with where we started roundtables last week, and I met with a bunch of stakeholders earlier this week, and we're starting the process to identify how we change our alcohol policy in Ontario. So it has an impact on things like corner stores and choice and convenience and what's where and when. It's not a predetermined outcome on all of it, so that we can have some discussions there. Interested in your thoughts over the next year as that goes forward and how it impacts on different communities in the area. Now, I know you'll want to talk about a few other things. I'm happy to leave them for you to ask me about if you wish, and then we can get into some other more planning based issues. So I can go on for the whole hour if you want, but if anybody has questions, I'm happy to field a couple. Or
Thank you. That was a good initial start, overview. So I said council, but of course staff, if you wish to ask any questions, please just let me know and we'll direct them through. I wonder if you'd just touch on the growth plan changes. I know that's an area that you're also quite involved with, and the heritage and the greenbelt mapping and growth plan changes.
Yeah, so I'll start with the heritage and the ag overlay, the agriculture overlay. I think there was general acknowledgement, certainly here, that the mapping was not sufficient. They had classed the middle of the Minisink Swamp as Class A farmland. Just little things like that. And so I started digging into why that is. Some of it's because the mapping was done centrally instead of on the ground. The county of Simcoe and the municipalities had better mapping than they did centrally. And that linkage didn't happen. So it didn't take long for the minister to understand, because it wasn't just us talking, it was across Ontario in different spots. So the minister put a pause on those and said, okay, let's get that right. And the ministry is re-engaged with the county to start fixing that kind of mapping. So the ag overlay and the heritage overlay, we're not disposing of them as a concept. It's just the mapping's wrong. So we've hit pause on that. In terms of the growth plan beyond that, do you want me to talk about that a bit? Sure. As everybody knows, we're in an extreme amount of growth in this part of the world. We are looking at our housing strategy. They're out doing consultations on that. And again, I actually don't know the answer. They were engaged with the county a little bit. I don't know if they've engaged with council directly yet on where we should be going on housing and housing stock and the types of housing and that sort of thing. Touches on affordable housing, which is an adjunct to that. We're taking a broad look at where we're headed generally. And so that consultation is out there. I don't perceive that you're going to have us deliver a document and say, okay, here, we're done. This is a bit more of an iterative process. I was on council back when they started the growth plan in the early 2000s. And it's evolved into some uniqueness in different parts that may not quite make sense. But it is a dialogue. You're not going to see it just delivered to you.
But you've mentioned a couple of times with county, but
Yeah.
if we don't hear from county, then the dialogue just remains with county and the province.
Absolutely.
So how can we find out at the municipal level about and have input?
Absolutely. So this is part of the reason that I was really happy to come here and engage, because if you're not hearing on some of these things, let me know, and then we'll make sure that you are. Obviously, I'm not sitting at county, so I don't know if they're talking to them and then not talking to you or talking to you. We can keep a bit of a rolling list of the things that are happening, and if you're not hearing about them directly, then we'll get that linkage. We'll make sure that's happening.
So for instance, with respect to the mapping that you talked about, you say you've been dealing with county, but there hasn't been input, or will there be, when will there be input at a municipal level
I will ask that question. They were going to the county first because they had the GIS. They had a lot of the mapping there. And when that mapping was developed, your staff will know more than I do,
Right.
how the local mapping fed into that mapping, if there is a formal linkage there or not. But if we're not sure, then let's find out.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Good. Okay, council. Councillor Hannah?
Thank you. Doug, I won't be seeing you anymore when I go for my pizza. They moved the building. or the
Domino's
store.
Pizza, but Tiffin's Curry is moving in, so come on by anyways.
There you go. Doug, the previous government created a requirement for all municipalities, counties to have code of conducts. I think some of us agree that it should have included the provincial politicians in that as well, and a code of conduct for provincial politicians. Not that you would need one, but others might. My point being is that if you go forward and do one for provincial politicians, and even if you don't, I believe it would be advantageous to have a template so all municipalities can work from that same template. The way it is right now, we all have to enter into the cost of paying a integrity commissioner to create a code of conduct if staff don't do it. And there's a number of different issues that are included. The four things that they brought out actually in the previous government were reasonable. I think we all agree it's not harmful to have a code of conduct. It's a good thing, but it's got beyond those four things in some code of conducts. I've read most of them now that exist currently in the province, and they're a lot longer than those four items that are included. So my question would be, if it's possible for the government to come out with a template with a basic code of conduct, it would make it easier for all municipalities to be able to adopt it.
That's interesting. Yep. I mean, as you know, it's a standard form across for conflict of interest because it's provincial legislation. So that kind of thing where it's a standard. Okay.
Okay. Councillor Cabral?
Thank you, Mayor. I was just curious, since you mentioned back in 2003, and I've been thinking about this the last couple of days, in particular with all of the new building and whatnot that's going to be happening in the south end. Back around 2003, you might recall there were some preliminary investigations into County Road 27 where the hydro right-of-way runs through just north of Barrie between Horseshoe Valley. And I believe that was in regards to the extension of Highway 427. And now I'm hearing from you that roads and infrastructure is going to be a priority. I'm just kind of curious to know whether or not that's something that's going to be revitalized again to come up into our area, because obviously it would make a significant impact on our township as well as everybody else's township on the way up.
Yeah, it's a good question. If I do know that if an application were to go in, and maybe this is something we can work on, an application were to go in and it was a joint application by more than one party, that it would be looked at. So again, it would be a provincial road, but there may be some room in that. I'll talk to the minister's office about how that would look. I do know that some people are still talking about the 404 and 400 link. I'm not sure on the priority list where that sits. I'll have to go back and figure that out. I'll get back to you on that. But there may be an opening there. That's a good call. Yeah.
Councillor Hannah?
Thank you, Mayor. And you mentioned about the insurance, you're looking at auto insurance, the auto insurance rates. If I can take you back to prior to Mike Harris, the NDP government brought in photo radar.
Mm-hmm.
It decreased the number of traffic accidents and injuries drastically. Everybody was obeying the speed limit as soon as they got into the Toronto area where the photo radar existed. There's municipalities, even though they've asked to be able to have it for school zones or safety zones. I don't know whether that's going to go forward or not. The photo cameras at intersections, I believe, is coming forward, and Barrie, I believe, was applied for to be able to have it. I realize that photo radar is not a popular thing. It was your government that got rid of it, my friend Mike Harris, and I had a discussion with him about that, and I thought it was a mistake because it was a benefit. The waiting time in emergencies were down, the number of accidents were down, and I believe it would help bring down the insurance rates because there would be a lot fewer accidents. not popular, but I think if you could get the rest of the government, NDP and what's left of the Liberals to all buy into it and make it an all-party decision, it may be something that the party would be able to pull off. But I really think it's a standard complaint that I think most of us hear all the time is about speeding in our municipality, and you hear about it everywhere. And photo radar does work. It's not popular because it works. So just something you could think about when you're looking at your insurance stuff.
It's interesting. I haven't had anybody raise that as an issue, but I can tell you I saw some polling within the last 2 years, and there was general support around hospitals and schools. Even if you didn't like it anywhere else, there was, and which is a bit intuitive. Yeah, interesting. I'm gonna have a lot of homework.
Director Schmidt.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to MPP Downey. Just have 2 questions for you, sir. You mentioned earlier the provincial federal. I guess so. The provincial federal infrastructure funding program. Just curious if that's replacing the Ontario Community Infrastructure Funding, so the OCIF application-based program. Because the township applied for an application back in August, September of last year, and we have yet to hear the status of that. And then the second question I had was just in regards to if you're able to speak to the development charge consultations that have happened and what are the next steps as it relates to that. Thank you.
Yep. So, and you can just call me Doug. Honestly, it's fine. So in terms of the funding pools, this $10 billion fund was just inked with the feds. So I anticipate it's a different set. I'll confirm that to make sure, but if it isn't a different set, we need to know whether you would have to reapply somehow, because that would be cumbersome and quite frankly counterintuitive to red tape. So I'll check that, whether that's part of the OSIP, but I anticipate it's not. I think it's new money. The development charge consultation, obviously it's in consultation. People are fairly, well, let's break down development charges. There's different kinds. So you have your industrial, which is a topic of conversation. And whether in terms of being open for business, we're in a competitive space with other jurisdictions. We're not talking from county to county, we're talking province to country. So that's one piece of it. But the other, and in particular in this part of the world, it's the north-south part of the county, right? There's growth happening, and we all know that the proposed increase in development charges in terms of education is significant. That's all part of that. I don't know the conclusion, but I can tell you there's nobody in the county that's involved that doesn't know about it and have some opinion on it. Yeah.
Councillor Cabral.
Thank you, Mayor Allen. Mr. Downey, this is more in a personal nature than it is based on council, but, and we don't have them up here yet, but we have the HUV lanes on the QEW, HUV lanes on the 404, I believe, and a few other HUV lanes. In the city of Toronto, motorcycles are allowed on the HUV lanes. I was wondering if the provincial government has any idea whether or not they may allow motorcycles on the HUV lanes on the provincial highways as they do in so many other jurisdictions.
Well, that's a very specific question, and I'm going to have to give you a very specific answer once I get it. I don't know, and I drive a bike, so I'm interested in that. Yeah, an old 84 Nighthawk, for what it's worth. Yeah, yeah, I don't know the answer. I'll find out. It's not, again, some of these things, they're not conversations that I've had, but I'll phone over to the office, and they may say, "What are you talking about?" And I'll phone you, and we'll connect you, and they'll know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Doug, conservation authorities.
Yes.
One of the questions or one of the topics that were brought up in the interviews and the regionalization were efficiencies, other ways of handling different organizations at the different stages of municipal government, and the possibility of regionalization of the conservation authorities. Both Oro-Medonte, as you know, and ourselves have both MVCA and the SSEA, and Julie has joined us today
Julie's
from
here.
the
Great.
SS SSEA. Any thoughts with respect to these?
Yeah, in terms of the conservation authorities, there's been a relationship between the government and the CAs for about 70 years. So not everybody knows that there's a deep history that's evolved over time. We have about 36 conservation authorities, and those are the more mandatory ones, if I can put it that way. The SSEA, as you know, is an independent, and you do fee for service, and you can contract, and they do excellent work. The oversight is the responsibility of municipalities, and I've heard of some of those challenges. When I was on council, I certainly dealt with some of the oversight. We're focused on making it better. We do want to plan together, when I say together, with you and with them. We want to improve accountability. We want to outline roles, who does what. There's been a bit of movement in that people have differing opinions on. And we want to make sure that we restore or maintain public trust in them. So I think there's some work to be done. I think there's some dialogue to be had. Certainly they serve a very important role, but it's kind of like the LHINs. It's different around the province, how the experience with them. And I think we need to do a bit of work on having that conversation to get them to a spot where everybody's happy.
So that is being worked on presently by your government?
There's some preparatory work there, and there will be discussions.
Thank you. Okay, Councillor Cabral?
Thank you. This question is in respect of plastics,
Yes.
recycling of. And I know that China is no longer taking a vast quantity of plastics that we used to export, and I think they paid us quite well for it, but unfortunately they're not interested in taking them anymore. And we're now finding ourselves in a position where it's costing more money to deal with that particular issue. I'm just wondering if the provincial government is taking any lead or any guidelines they're going to put out to try and help municipalities with that particular aspect of it. Of course, trash in ours is at the regional level, but it still affects all of the residents within Springwater as well.
Yeah, the plastics issue, it's part of you can divert things from the landfill, but you have to be able to do something with them. That's the challenge. And I'll tell you a really quick funny story. My wife isn't watching, so I hope she doesn't see the replay. When I was on council, it was a phone-in show, and so somebody phoned in and they said, I see the garbage truck picking up diapers and throwing them in the garbage truck. Why are they not getting recycled? Well, the city I was on council with was in between contracts, but we didn't want people to break the habit of putting them out, but they're going in the garbage. Well, I pretty quickly identified as my wife phoning in on the call-in show. so I can get really personal really quick in terms of giving answers. Yeah, we need a better strategy for some of that. I was talking with a local resident. I don't have his permission, so I won't say his name, but he's in the plastics recycling world, and there's some innovation that can happen, but it has to become cost effective. We do have to be careful that we're not downloading responsibility and cost again, it's the same taxpayer, so we need a broader strategy. We are looking at, if you have a chance to see our environmental plan that Minister Phillips put out recently, there is a big section talking about litter, and not just litter, but that type of recycling and where we need to go. So that, again, he's started that conversation on the provincial level. But it's been floated out there about the idea of maybe banning plastic straws. It's really interesting how something that people are familiar with strike a chord, and yet a bigger issue that you may get into on waste diversion, it's a little harder to understand.
Most of us might be old enough to remember when plastic bottles weren't available at the grocery store. Everything came in glass and it was all recyclable, and the Boy Scouts used to do their, bottle drives and whatnot, and all that stuff was easily recyclable because there was some, intrinsic value to it. Whereas with the plastic, that's probably one of the potential problems. Is there any option to maybe look at seeing about putting a deposit on plastic containers, and at least that way they're not going to be litter? Hopefully people will bring them back.
Yeah, you put a value on a commodity, people pay attention to it. One of the last jurisdictions to have strictly glass was PEI. I remember going over there, and you couldn't buy Coke except in glass. And part of it had to do with we have to get it off the island if we have it here. So, yeah.
Just on that, I mean, it was in the news this week that the government might bring in something with respect to single-use plastic, but that hasn't been announced, has it yet? Is it?
We put it out there for comment, for
comment.
reaction. People are reacting to it. I think people want to do the right thing.
Right.
And they want to do the right thing to the point of where it's a major inconvenience. So trying to find that balance where you can enable the right behavior without causing an inherent problem. That's why we're throwing it out for comment. Yeah.
Right. Other questions, points? Councillor Hannah?
Thank you. Sorry, Doug, I don't want to keep giving a whole bunch of things to write
No,
down
it's
here,
great.
but I know the provincial government, you're looking at cost savings in your budget.
Yes.
I gotta say, about 20 years ago, I had this conversation with the minister, and we talked about duplication or doubling up of ministries, if you like, because, for example, the OPP police the highways, as you know. You got the Ministry of Transport to look at truck traffic, licensing, overloads, and so on, and they got these nice little booths set up on the highways. The enforcement officer for the Ministry of Transport, he stops a truck, if you like. The driver's either under suspension or impaired, or there's drugs or something. Doesn't have the powers of arrest. He can't enforce the criminal code. He has to call and wait for the OPP to arrive. When the OPP arrives, now whatever time that takes and so on, sometimes it's a lot longer than I think the gentleman on the Ministry of Transport likes. Now you got two people involved, going to court. You've got a duplication of services there that could all be avoided if the Ministry of Transport came under the umbrella of the OPP and they married them all up and put them together. When people are driving down the highway and they're in minor accident, they pull into these weigh scales, if you like. The officer in the weigh scales can't do anything. Again, they phone and they wait for the OPP to call. All these things would be, in my view, more efficient, and I think it'd save a lot of dollars just with a wasted court time, never mind the enforcement issues that come when you got two different agencies involved. Just something to think about, and I think sooner or later, one of those officers in the Department of Transport is gonna have a problem because they're not armed, and the person that they've apprehended or tried to apprehend it is gonna resist, and I just think it's like, I believe now you got your border guards are now armed, which didn't used to be, and that was because they had issues and they weren't armed, so. You're looking for information, I'm just trying to help you out.
Yeah, no, we do have to think of these things outside of the pillars. And somebody from the region of Waterloo was suggesting a couple of weeks ago that their bylaw enforcement officers can't ask for ID. They're just not empowered to do that, and yet they have to give out all the tickets at St. Patrick's Day and Oktoberfest. And the only tickets that get paid are from the people who are doing the right thing. They have tons of tickets that never get paid, and they can't prove who they were because they didn't ask for ID because they can't. Just there's all sorts of, and it's because of this departmental thinking. So I'm open to any of that. This is the kind of thing that we need to do, and we need to figure out who should be doing what, as it relates not just between departments, but as it relates between levels of government. Again, there are issues that are sometimes very difficult to deal with, and I'll use a local example where we're dealing with opioids as a challenge. Who's responsible for what? Who's doing what? It's a provincial thing. That municipalities aren't necessarily shouldn't be burdened with that. It's a tougher issue, and when you get into things like smoking in restaurants, I remember when that was out, saying, why is the individual municipality dealing with? Why is this not a provincial issue? So I'm open to discussions about if there's something that you're having to deal with and it's a pan-Ontario issue, let's identify that and see who's best able to deal with it, and not worry about who's going to take the most heat for it. That's not what it's about. It's about getting the decision made and consistency across. So no, I'm open to that kind of stuff. That's great.
I'll watch to see it happen if they end up being in the same part of it's the same agency, because it's just duplication of services, but you got that division there, and I think it's, people want to protect their own turf, and they don't want to amalgamate, if you like.
Yeah. Can I touch a little bit on where we are financially in the province, just so that it's
Please do.
So when we took over, we're spending about $40 million a day more than we were bringing in every day. $40 million. The deficit was $15 billion with a B. And to give you a sense of scale, when you say million to billion, it's really hard to conceptualize the difference between those two numbers. But if you take 1 million seconds, that's 11 and a half days. But if you take 1 billion seconds, that's 32 years. So these numbers are not close. When I say 15 billion, that's a big number. We found savings of about $3.2 billion, and nobody lost a job, no service was cut. It was simple things like we don't get coffee service in the ministry. I bring my own coffee. We don't have we don't have desk phones because we have cell phones. I don't need a desk phone. I need somebody who can route through to my cell phone. That's what happens. We don't have fax machines. There are all sorts of things. We scale that across government. We found a bunch of those kinds of things. And so 3.2 billion we saved, but we turned 2.7 billion back to consumers by things like not raising driver's license fees, hunting and fishing fees. There's a whole series of things that we've turned value back to people who pay the taxes. So that came about 500 million came off our deficit for the year, down to 14.5 billion. And then when we got our third quarter numbers, we saw that the economy expanded a little bit and a few other pieces moved. We found another billion to take off that deficit. So we're sitting at 13.5 billion to the end of this fiscal year, which is March 31st. And we're going to be putting our budget out April the 11th, which is a Thursday. That's traditionally when it comes out. It comes out at 4 o'clock after the markets close so that people can't react through the market immediately. And we're going to move towards a balanced budget. We're in a reasonable amount of time. And the way Minister Fedeli describes it, it's sort of the Goldilocks theory that we're going to not go too fast. We're not going to go too slow. We're going to try and get it just right so that it's stable and predictable and responsible. And we protect the things that matter on the way through doing that. If you move too fast, you lose people, and we don't want to do that. So as of March 31st, we'll be sitting with a deficit of about 13.5 billion for the fiscal year. We'll have a debt of about 347 billion, so over a third of a trillion. Now, I told you 1 million seconds is 11 and a half days, and 1 billion seconds is 32 years. Well, 1 trillion seconds is 32,000 years, so we're a third the way there. We have to get this thing straightened out. We just have to. So we will have tough decisions to make, but we're trying to do it by engaging people. And I think we're doing a very good job of engaging people on issues as we raise them. I'll give you an example. The alcohol review that we just started the roundtables last week, we set it out for comment, for people to comment online. We had 33,000 people send in comments, send in opinions. People want to have input. The Minister of Education on the curriculum review sent out for comment, did roundtables, 72,000 people, individuals, 72,000. So people are hungry to be engaged in fixing this with us. And so anything that you think we can do to make that even better, definitely open to opinions, whether it be roundtables, teleconferences, town halls they call them, and any number of things. But that engagement piece, we need to get some of this stuff 100% right. We can't miss the mark on it. There's too much at stake. The debt and the deficit are too big for us to ignore, and the programs are too important for us to lose people. But there's some numbers anyways. I'm open to.
Thank you. Our CEO of Libraries, Jody Delgado, has a question.
Hello. Through you, Mr. Mayor, to MPP Downey. Libraries, especially small and rural libraries, act as hubs for Service Ontario. We provide information for our residents, access to online resources and online forums, and of course online licensing. Over the years, we have received a very tiny amount of funding for this project, and with lots of stipulations, of course, on how it may be spent in order to help our residents with the Service Ontario program. There was no information whatsoever about the intake for the 2018-2019 program, and we have not received any communication whether that was because it was under review or canceled entirely. So I was just curious as to what would be happening for the 2019-2020 program, and whether it's reviewed or canceled, if that can be communicated to the libraries, please.
And that's on the Service Ontario part in particular, that program? Okay. I will get you an answer on that, absolutely. Yeah.
The Environmental Resource Recovery Center, you're aware of, and the official plan amendment that the county put in has had 3 appeals come forward. Are you able to update us from your perspective or the government's perspective on the process, where it's going?
Yeah, knowing that I was coming here, I pulled off some of the information. So, knowing that there were the three appellants, I've asked from the ministry, so just so that you're aware of the resources that I have for this kind of thing. Each minister's office has an individual who is the MPP liaison, and not just for our party, but for any MPP, so that they can phone them and say, here's my articulated issue, can you get me an answer? And that's their job, is to get us an answer. So I talked to the MPP liaison in that department and said, can you get me an update from it? And at the same time, I asked for an update on the stuff from the fall as well, on the EA that was appealed. So I don't have that answer, but it is in process, and I will be able to get it back to you to find out where we are. It was just filed in February, so it's a bit quick. I'd be surprised if there was some immediate motion on it, but we'll roadmap that a little bit and get back to you.
So that was going to be my next question, the EAs with respect to the mid-secondary plan. So
Yeah.
they're going to get an update on that as well?
I've asked for an update on that as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
The healthcare amendments and the new healthcare plan that was just brought in, announced by MPP Elliott.
Yeah.
What impacts do you see that having in your constituencies?
Yeah, so they're moving to a hub system. The Ministry of Health is moving to a hub system. So there will be 8 hubs, and I know that there is some interest in one of the local regional hospital being a hub. They've raised that as a possibility. They being RVH. So that's something that may have an impact on us locally in terms of how that develops. I've also been quite engaged with both OSMH, Waypoint, and GBGH. I have a meeting with GBH coming up. I don't know the date off the top of my head, because the mid-size hospital funding formula is a challenge. And so I'm trying to work out exactly how we may go forward, because if we're going to change the model and we're going to move to a hub model, we have to make sure that we address some of those small and medium-sized hospital challenges as well. So I think there will be impact. I think there'll be impact locally. There will not be frontline job losses. I don't know if you know Peter Bethlen-Falvey. He's the president of the Treasury Board. Very, very bright guy. He used to run the DBRS, the rating service that gives governments ratings. So he knows his way around a balance sheet, I can tell you that. And one of the things that he's talked about was how many hands does a dollar go through before it hits the front line? Let's start to measure that and see if we're actually delivering the service that we should for the dollar that we're spending. And I think healthcare is an area where we can do better. And the health budget is 50% of our budget, and education's a third, or a quarter, I guess. So half and a quarter. Third largest is social services, and fourth largest is interest on the debt. We pay about $1 million an hour on the debt. So healthcare is an area where we can do better, and so I think you will see some change locally.
Councillor Moore.
Just wanted, excuse me, through you, Mayor, to MPP Downey. I just wanted to make one quick comment about how that process is working right now. If you could just maybe take back a message that the LHIN boards were dissolved, and about 200 people lost their jobs as board members, and it was done suddenly without notice. And so those folks weren't allowed the opportunity to have a last meeting or to say goodbye to their colleagues. So I just wonder that if we could take that back to say that maybe could have been handled a bit better. Thanks.
Okay, I'll convey the sentiment.
Councillor Ritchie.
Thank you, Mayor Allen, and thank you, Doug, for coming. It's nice to see our MP hard at work, and you've got a thankless job. It's hard to turn back 15 years of not having a government to turn around to think we're going to have a government. So you got a hell of a task ahead of you. There's 444 municipalities in the province of Ontario, and the infrastructure amount that we were given is about $511 million or less than that. So when you added it all up, we really didn't get a lot of money. So to hear, and it's nice to know that they're taking a hard look at the infrastructure, asset management plans, all that, because that right on the ground floor there, that fund there that you mentioned there, right at the first of your speech, a lot of municipalities, they depend on that, we depend on that, and very crucial in our budget planning for the year. So I'm glad they're taking that step, and the more money that trickles down to the municipalities, the more infrastructure is done, the more we're able to look at our after our asset management plan. That's money right on the ground floor there, and it doesn't get any better than that, because we're the closest form of government to the people itself. So, and you know that better than anybody. I'd like to switch channels for a minute. From 2014 to 2018, in our last term, we were very aggressive in fixing up some of the infrastructure deficit that we seen in our Parks and Rec department. And no disrespect to the people that run it, just that past councils never bothered to put any money into it. We set aside money for boards, hockey boards. We just did a lot to fix things up with. And having said that, the people that are coming out now it's just a total different climate altogether. And it's too bad we can't gauge that and say, look at what we're doing. We're getting people off the couch. We're getting them outside. They're getting involved with something. And too bad there isn't funding there to recognize that and to push that even further. We've got a new skate pad over on Spence Avenue there, and people are out there all the time. And I'm very proud of the efforts that we've taken over the last 4 years. I hope we continue to do that. And that's what makes our community, things like that. And that's what put us back in here. Thank you again for coming.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the whole point of building things is so people will use them. I was actually this morning at Mount St. Louis because they're having a national championship of skiers over there, and just went over to chat with some of them, and that's provincially funded for a portion of that. There are funding streams for that. My office has some experience in those types of things, and so as funding streams show up, we will let you know, so that opportunities can be had to engage people, for sure. And that the fourth branch of the funding that I had mentioned at the front is on recreation. So I don't know exactly what that looks like, but we'll have that conversation as well.
Okay, before we wrap up, any further questions or comments? Good. Well, thank you very much, Doug, for coming. It's been very valuable. It's always interesting to read the press, but to be able to talk to your MPP and get your perspective and some of the inside knowledge is very good. We'd like to do this at least a couple of times a year going forward.
Sounds great to me. I'll get some answers to the questions and get back to you. And I think everybody on council has my personal number. If you don't, let me know after, and we'll make sure you do.
And you're generally in your office on Fridays?
Well, when the House sits Monday to Thursday. When the House doesn't sit, I'm in my office every day. So it just depends on the parliamentary calendar on how that works.
Good, good. Well, thank you again very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And so we'll just do some housekeeping, then I'll say goodbye to you. Can I have a mover and a seconder, please? Deputy Mayor Coghlan, Councillor Ritchie, that bylaw 219-032 to confirm and adopt the proceedings of council. The special meeting held on March 14, 2019, listed herein be signed and sealed by the mayor and clerk. All in favor? Carried. And a mover and seconder, Councillor Moore and Councillor Cabral, that the special meeting of the Township of Springwater does now adjourn at 4:55 PM to meet again in regular meeting on March 20, 2019 at 6:30 PM in the council chambers, Admin Center, Minnesing. All those in favor? Carried. Thank you.